Hello to ZFS TV. My name is Christian, and today we want to speak about Proxmox virtual environment that's coming with ZFS. And if you have a server like me that's very small and has only a small number of disks, you are forced to boot from ZFS. This is a great thing, but it's not easy and not very good supported by the vendor. So we have to understand how it's worked to help ourselves if something is failing. So as you can see here, my microserver, first generation, it's the first version of the 10th generation of the HP microservers, has 2 disks, and I currently installed a fresh Proxmox system to have an idea what's happening on it. Today I started with the Proxmox version 7.2, so this is a very recent version to today. We are recording this in beginning of June 2022, and we are about version 7.4, I think. We will see it soon because we are making an update and have a look at the system. So what means booting from ZFS? And this could be very different because you don't have a native booting on Linux with Proxmox. Perhaps you are familiar with TrueNAS or FreeNAS earlier. That has a real native booting, but not Proxmox, and this can bring you in trouble. On the first boot, if you press the 11 key to have a selection what you are going to boot, you can see there is a lot of, you can choose, and you can see here the Linux boot manager, and it says Linux boot manager, and here it says UEFI boot. So this should be, as far as I know, the old CRUB booting, and this should be the Intel SSD here, what's mentioned, it's both mentioned beyond. This should mean the EFI booting. So the difference is, there's one great thing, you can see the vendor of the disk, but you can't see the serial number, so you're not sure what disk you are booting from. But Proxmox has 3 partitions normally in the newer installation. So there's one for BIOS booting, CRUB, there's one for EFI booting, and this 2 disks, this means for boot selection. So have a look at the first one, what we are getting. Yes, that's very interesting because you can see here in the middle you find the selection. So this means this is a EFI booting, even when it was mentioned to be a BIOS booting. So have a look at the boot progress. So you can ignore the first messages because it's something related about the hardware. When it changes the resolution, this is great. So the change root environment is hitting, and here's the login. So have a look what we have there. When we ended up in booting after a login with SSH, and perhaps we have changed our keys and disabled the password login, we have a look at our freshly installed system, or perhaps it's an older system, and first have a look at the disks. And you can use lsblk, that means list block devices. And as you can see here, you have 1 disk here and 1 disk here, and especially you have 3 partitions. And this 3 partition scenario doesn't mean anything because there are at least 2 or 3 popular partition scenarios from earlier Proxmox versions. So we started on 7, so this is a time where EFI booting is supported. On earlier versions, it could be completely different. Let's have a look at 2 or 3 partition scenarios. So when you are opening the CF disk tool with one of the disks, you can see you have exactly 3 partitions, as mentioned. You have here a BIOS boot partition, so this means there could be a CRUB. Loader, the blue one, perhaps you remember the blue bar at the top, not the one you have seen. The second partition is the EFI system. This means booting out of a VFAT. This is basically a Windows partition, not really mounted with a kernel image inside. And then you have the data, the ZFS member. This means your data is on the 3rd partition. Even if you break your installation, you have still at least your virtual machine environment, so your Linux containers and your virtual machines. If you have an older installation, say you started with Proxmox 3 or 4 or 5 or perhaps early 6 versions, you only had the crap bootloader and your partition scheme was looking completely different like this. So this is an older installation. What we have here, you can see the first is the crap boot. So this is your Proxmox installation and your virtual machines and containers, and there is a Solaris reserved 1 partition. If you want to resize your pool by replacing your disks and want to use the auto expand feature, I hardly recommend to just delete this partition. So when you are replacing this disk by the method I'm mentioning later and explaining later, you have to remove this partition to make the ZFS system give it the possibility to expand the partition. So if it's there, if this one is growing, this one would be in the way. So you have to delete this in advance. So if you have an older one, you have to use this. If you are fresh on Proxmox VE, I hardly recommend to start with our post installer. This post installer is a great thing, and you can find it here on github.com/bashclub, and then you can use the Proxmox ZFS post install. What it does basically, it disables the enterprise repository and is replacing it by the no subscription repository. We are Proxmox Silver partner, and we are hardly recommend to use the subscription to get your updates more tested and later. But if you are only on testing, this would be a great way to get updates, because if you don't do it, you only get security updates and no system upgrades. Upgrade to the latest version, install some necessary tools. Perhaps you are offline because your firewall is virtualized and you're offline and need a tool of those. And yes, you can have it. It's using ZFS Auto Snapshot, as I mentioned in the last episode, setting the cache, making a backup of the etc folder, because it's the etc PVE folder is a database folder. So if you are booting from a disk, you will have the problem, you experience the problem that the etc PVE folder is empty. So if you want to reinstall your machine, you need a copy of this data the fastest way. And the best way is to have a data set you can find the data in. And this later is called rpool pveconf, and the folder has the same name. Some swappiness and some extra features. And how to use it? It's quite simple. Just start this script by simply copy and paste this, and then he's asking you for the parameters. I say to everything yes now. I explained everything in the last episode, and I'm only doing this to get the latest version of Proxmox VE to have the most recent view on the system. So if the post installer has done his work, you have the latest version, and because that your Proxmox is running from kernel means the KVM virtualization as well the ZFS file system and RAID is running from kernel, so we have to reboot. And you can check the things he has done. We will see with the tool Proxmox, boot, tool, status, and you can see here, this is a version with only EFI booting. We tried installing the first setup last week with grub and EFI, and then we swapped the BIOS to grub, and from this point on, Proxmox was not longer updating the grub, so you have to know how to handle this. As well, I verified a fresh installation, an older installation with a fresh update, and this is not using the Proxmox boot tool, it's still using grub. So you have to know if your system has booted with UEFI or grub, and you can see it here if you have the Proxmox boot tool status, and you can see system currently booted with UEFI. And on a system that's not with UEFI, that has never seen UEFI, it says it's putting out some error messages, and then you know you are on grub. If you have both, you would experience here the information that you're booted from BIOS or grub. Let's do a reboot. So on the first reboot, after we have done the updates, we still have the Linux boot manager for some reason, but obviously he's changing or transferring it to the UEFI boot. There's no crap bootloader anymore, and this seemed to be identified by a kind of compatibility layer from the HP server. So as well, there is no hint what disk you are booting. So if you want to know if both disks are booting, you can try both after it. The simple problem is if you have 20 disks and you have crap booting, you have no idea what disk can boot or is able to boot. If you're using the UEFI boot manager, you can see here, you have the you can only see the disks they are capable to boot, and this is a great advantage of EFI. So let's boot this one. So and after the first update, you experience a selection of some kernels, and this can have a great advantage because Proxmox itself is running on ZFS after the first boot. So what he's doing is going to this partition with the EFI, booting a kernel, doing a change root, and then he's booting all the features like the Linux tools, the Linux software, but the kernel itself, it's on the small partition. This means if your Proxmox is running on a dataset, and it's running on a dataset, you can roll it back. For example, you experience some problems with the installation, you can roll back only your Proxmox installation, not your virtual disks, not your Linux containers. And then you can simply choose, after rolling back the machine, you can simply choose the older kernel of the both. This would be, let's see, this is this one. And then you have the suitable kernel to your current environment. But we did not roll back anything. So let's get into the system and have a look how it's working. So this is the kernel. And then he's changing the root, changing the resolution, booting up. And after the first boot, after the update, we are back and can have us log in to the system again. And we will see with the status tool what we are dealing with. Here we are, 2 disks. But what if one disk is failing? What is the best thing to do if one disk is failing? Let's have a look how Proxmox is built. Zpool status is showing you the current situation. There is a rpool. Here's everything on. This is a mirror numbered by 0. Array 10 would be mirror 1, mirror 2 behind. Here are the disks with the correct serial numbers here. And it's a good idea to note the serial numbers when you are building the computer. Just simply note the serial numbers, makes it easier to replace later without shutting down. And you can see all the data is on partition 3. This means, ZFS list, the only thing we want to keep, if it's hard, is this one here, the PV1, and this especially is mounted to root. This means everything you are starting like the top tool is running on root, and it's this data set. This means if this one has auto snapshots, that's done automatically and it's keeping it, you can roll it back if you have problems. And if your kernel is too new, you can simply boot the old kernel. Or you can boot a newer kernel from the installation media. That's very interesting. Look at an older system that experienced some problems with disks and how we found out before we got in trouble. This is a Proxmox running for about, let's see, 5 years, 4 years, something about this. And you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 disks and 1 SSD. This one is for performance only. And you can see here, you have this old partition layout, the BIOS boot, the data, and the reserved. So if you want to enlarge your partition, you know this newsletter, if you want to enlarge your partition, you hardly have to remove this one before you are doing the auto expand. And this is because if you are changing a hard drive with 10 megabytes from another vendor, perhaps this is not a disk with exactly 10 gigabytes, so some megabytes or kilobytes are different. And if you have these reserved partitions, this gives you the headspace to move and to use not the exactly disk for a replacement. And the thing is, this one has a RAID running with 4 disks. So why are there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 disks? And this is simply explained here what can happen. Here's one disk we had trouble with. And we watched this disk for a while, and we have seen, so while Proxmox is telling you the smart test simply passed, I did not feel comfortable with this disk. So have a look at the errors with it. And you can see the 400 days statistics over a year. You can see there are 2 errors of 4, and this is growing. And at this point, this 2022 in, I think in March, as far as I can see, we decided to replace the disk before it's failing. If you have an expensive, costly, pricey hardware supplied disk station, for example, you have a HP or more expensive, they will show you the errors at the very end because they don't want to replace it. I want to replace the disks very early because before something is happening, before a problem occurs, and as long as I have warranty. It's not in my interest to make the disk errors growing, so I would tell Seagate or whoever, this disk is failing, the others not, please replace it. And if they replace the disk, it's still in warranty, and I can replace the disk before without any loss of consistency. So this means if my RAID is up and running, I can add another disk, and I can replace the disk before a disk is failing. And that's what we are doing today. On my installation today, we are using 2 disks from Intel, 480 gigabytes. Those are mostly better than the 500s. And disks here, SSD disks, are very rare. We used almost everything, and I don't have any left here. But here's a Kingston 480 disk, so this is not the same vendor, and there's also data on it. I hardly recommend before doing anything, use the disk if it's already used. For example, you can have a USB adapter like this and format it with Windows. Then it's, later it's easier to identify the disk and to be sure you're not formatting or doing any stuff with the wrong disk. But I'm happy with it. So let's have a look. We can use the dmessage wfollow, and this is a kind of live log. So for example, if I remove the mouse, you can see the mouse USB disconnect, and I reconnect the mouse, and you can see, oh, this was the keyboard. Okay, I removed the keyboard. So you can see this log is live. And now I'm taking this SSD and putting it just in the middle slot between those other 2 disks. And we will see if this one is working or not. Today it's working. We had some problems with this disk. And as far as can see, this is SDC. So have a look at CF disk dev SDC. Okay. As you can see, this is also a disk with Proxmox on it. And what I have to do is to delete all partitions on it. Delete to avoid any problems. Because if this also has an R pool, on next boot, perhaps he's confused and is finding 2 R pools, and this wouldn't boot. And what's really interesting here, we can see the start sector on 2048. This could be a problem as well. We will see. So what I do now is I'm writing this one. Yes. And to be sure everything is fine, this system is capable of hot swap, the newer microserver 10 Gen, not just removing the disk for a second and then trying to reinsert the correct slot. We hot swapped the disk. If you're hot swapping disks, you should verify on the dmessage tool if they are really the correct, if there's really the correct link. I experienced some problems with disks on hot swap that only linked with 1.5 gigabits per second. On the next boot, everything is fine, but perhaps you have an extra look on it. So let's have a look what we have now. ZF disk, so we have the A and B with, that's interesting, the start of 34. And here for the AFI, on starting here, that could be interesting. We'll see if we experience some problems. And then we have the data itself. So what we could do very easy, we can say zpool status, and just replacing, say this disk is faulty. And what we could do simply would be something like zpool, replace, rpool, and say this partition. And we can say replace it with SDC or def SDC, whatever he likes to have. But then, if you're doing it like this disk would not be bootable anymore, and there's only one disk left. So if you have a big RAID with 10 disks or 6 or 8 or something like this, and you are in a hurry and you want to replace a disk fast, you can do it. And you remember then that it's not possible to boot from the disk, but you have 6 or 7 others. If this would be the last one, then I would not risk it, and I would do it the way we will show you now. A good idea is to go to Proxmox's wiki, and you have a look at ZFS on Linux to find out anything you want to know about ZFS. If you want to experience more, you come to our site. So let's have a look with replacing a disk, and you can see there is some explanation how to do things with ZFS. Change a failed device. This is not exactly that we want to do, because we are showing it today because we have a slot available without waiting as long the drive is failing. It's not faulty. It's a middle healthy drive. We want to replace it. So the way would be replace zpool, replace force, because perhaps some data's on it, the pool, the old and the new device. This basically things are working. So, but to make it bootable, we also need the partition table and the AFI bootloader, so we have to take care about this. So we remember SDA and B are okay, SDC is the new one. So what we do now, and we are doing it not exactly the way they recommend, have a look. We say sgdisk, so then we say the healthy boot device. So this is def SDA minus R, def SDC. And this is the healthy one, and this is the one that has been emptied by me. So let's have a look. We do it here like this. So if you want to replace more than one drive, you can repeat this step a couple of times. Then with the G, it's getting a new GUI ID. This means this makes the drive unique, so there is no misunderstanding or naming. And then you could replace the old partition 3, we remember partition 3, with a new one. The thing is, if I'm doing this right now, I have to wait until this is done. This can take from 2 minutes up to 2 days. Your mileage may vary, how much data you have on your set. So what I do now, I want to be sure if my disk will boot, because if I'm replacing both disks or one and it's not booting, I'm already on a new disk, but perhaps it's not booting. So I try to make the disk booting first and then replacing the data on the disk. So we are taking care about the first and the second partition. I'm very interested in the new partition layout because we experienced those sectors. Let's have a look what he's done, that's very interesting. So the SG disk was able to access this here and also added the AFI system to here. If you have a disk that's not suitable for SG disk, you also can create those partitions starting from another point, but you have to calculate if it's fitting at the end. So you can create your partitions by hand, and then you just say starting from 2048 to this, and then you can say type and choose the correct type of the partition, and then you are fine. If you are planning to resize the disks, I mean to replace with a bigger disk, you have seen there is no reserved partition. You simply can say zpool set auto expand is on rpool. This means if you have a rate 1 or 10, when you replaced 2 drives with bigger ones, it's automatically growing. If you have a rate Z or rate 5, 6, 7 equivalent, you have to replace any of them, and then you experience a new size on it. So here we are fine. Then let's see what Proxmox is telling us now. And I think this manual is not the best because it says Proxmox boot tool format new disks ESP, whatever an ESP is. ESP stands for AFI partition. Okay, here it's mentioned in the meantime. Bootable disk setup by Proxmox installer since 5.4. And here setting up and so on. Okay, we are talking about the second partition. This means I have to format the dev SDC, the second partition. The first is grub. This is not grub. The first, the second is AFI. This is this one, and the third is our data later. So what I do is format it, and it says, okay, here's something on it. That's interesting because I did not do it. Say minus fourth, and as you can see, he's formatting it with a FAT system, a simple window system. That's what your AFI is doing later. It's looking where are AFI partitions with a AFI tag and offering to boot it. And then you say init. And this is copying all the, you can see it here, 2 kernels on 6 drives. So then you say status. Yes. Oh, sorry, not this one. Proxmox boot tool, and you say status. And obviously this would work with a broken drive as well, but here we are fine. And now we can do many things. We could simply replace it, or we can add a third mirror. A mirror could not be only 2 drives. And the most I want to know is if this one is booting. So let's have a reboot of the system and go to the boot selection menu of the server. So after we used the Proxmox boot tool with format and init, we rebooted the system and pressed the 11 key to see what boot offers do we have. Here we are. So what do we have here? Linux boot manager on Intel, Linux boot manager on Intel, UEFI on Intel, UEFI on Intel, but there is as well a Linux boot manager on Kingston and a UEFI on Kingston. And that's the one we are interested in because we want to remove one of those Intels because it's failing soon. So let's have a look if it's booting, and yes, you can see you have both kernels, and then we can boot in the system. Let's have a look what it's doing now. Oh, that's great. So we have a problem here, and I think this is caused by the fact the problem is I had the last time this disk formatted with a Proxmox. Let's have a look. Zpool import. That's great for this show. And you can see we have 2 rpools, and the top one is failing. So this means the deleting of the disk did not work. So what I can do now is, for the moment, I could do two things at the moment. I can simply remove the disk for a minute. I know it's booting, but we are talking about the third partition now. Or I can say zpool import, and I say the unique identifier. Let's make some debugging. 84115842155091138. So that was a part I told you better to format it as rpool. So let's see if this is working. Yes, and then you can say exit. This is the thing you can fail on. Never boot two rpools will cause this problem. And if you experience this error, you are fine doing it this way. So let's have a look what our system is telling us now. So here we are back on SSH and say zpool status. And zpool import should show us the, yes, this is the one disk, that's failing. Oh, this is not the correct one. Okay, this is very odd. No, here we are. This is the disk we have seen recently, and this is the SD. Let's have a look what it is. LSBLK should be SDB now. CF disk dev SDB. And the problem was we booted this one here and here because we created the correct partition image. He found the old rpool. Very dangerous, very dangerous. So, but we don't have a problem from here. So what we do now, we simply forget about this partition and say zpool status, because we know this disk could boot the second partition with the EFI, but not the correct data. So then we have to identify the correct disk. Let's see. We say ls althr dev disk by ID, and let's say grep Kingston. How it is spelled with the great capital letters. So let's say this one. No. Let's say this the live one. Let's say this one is suspect. We want to replace this partition, grep Kingston, and then we have the correct labels here, and then we can say zpool replace from the rpool, and we want to have this one replaced with the third partition. The third partition, that's important. With the third partition, that's big enough. Here we go. And then he says, okay, there is an rpool, but this is the older one, this is my fault. And I say, yes, I know this bullshit and I'm forcing it. And then we are fine. Zpool status, say we refresh every 5 seconds. You can see that it's on the way, and it's still replacing the data. And here we are done. I say break. Hopefully I can stop it. You can see the scenario here when it was replacing the Intel disk with the Kingston, and here it's done. That means we can replace, we can remove the disk. Let's have a look what disk we have been replaced. This should be this one. So we are say ls, and we grep by the old name, and we can see is the SDC drive we have replaced. And what I do now is simply doing the hard way and simply removing it. So here we are. Here's the disk I just removed. Will we have a problem from here on? Zpool status? No. The system is still up and running. If there would be any virtual machines containers, they would continue running. And the only thing you will have is if you need the Proxmox boot tool, and you say status, you see that the old disk here is gone, is broken. This won't come back, so I say clean up or clean up. No, it's only clean. Yes, and then he says this it's not been found. And if you make the status output again, you see everything is fine. This means if there is a new kernel, the new kernel is going to be written on the two disks, on the Intel and the other one. And this would be the safe way to replace a Proxmox boot disk without any trouble. So let's verify if everything is fine and have another last reboot of the system to see that it's really working. And as I mentioned, the problem I experienced with a disk earlier, that he said the import has failed, was my own fault because I did not use an empty disk for replacement. I used a disk that has already been used with ZFS and Proxmox. That was not the best idea. But you have seen how it's working. Even if there were two R pools, there was a unique identifier, the number I typed in. I said Z pool, import the unique identifier as R pool. Then I wrote exit from this place on. The RAID was imported and he changed the route and finished booting to the system. If I would have used the other one, the other pool, he would have been booted in the installation I had on my classes last week. So what do we have here? Let's verify again that this Kingston bastard is booting. And we have both two kernels. Let's have a look if this one is booting or not. And we are back on Proxmox in a second. Starting. Let's have a look. It's still working. SSH, zpool status, looking great, and zpool. Now the boot tool status is reporting great booting. And let's make another fun thing at the end. Try something I've never done. Let's add a third boot and data device to have the most senseless R pool at the end. Even this one is already formatted. So, but I give a shit on it. Okay, let's say dmessage, and I'm entering the disk, slot it in the ATA slot, hot plugin, and yes. Let's see, here's the disk. Let's see if it's finding the old pool because we replaced the pool. So I expect the disk has been, the old R pool should have been deleted. So if you would like to, you also can replace the disk before, remove it before replacing it. Then you have no redundancy while replacing, but you still have a copy of your data on the disk if it was mirror. It's just an idea. So let's have a look. It says no pools available. So this is SDC. Let's have a look at the partition table. There you see the old one still. Okay, I keep it. But I say SG disk. I say replace dev. I do not have to do it. I do it just for the good show. So fresh partition table, and then we say new GUI ID. Unfortunately, I don't have the larger disk here, so perhaps I show in another show the expanding of disk pool. But seriously, simply have a look that no partition is behind. Use bigger disks, enable auto expand, and this will work latest at the reboot. So here we are, and then we have the Proxmox boot tool format, and we say this is the SDC at this point. Boot tool second partition, we have to format it first. Format, boot tool format SDC second partition is fine. Then we init it. Yes, it's copying the kernels. Then we have the status. Okay, we have 3 disks capable to boot. And then we say zpool status. Okay, we have 2. And now comes a new lesson. Zpool attach rpool. And then it's, let's have a look. Dev disk by ID, grab Intel, SDC. We know it's SDC at this point. Yes, here we have the third partition, this one. And then we can say attach rpool and have this one at the end. If you're not sure what it's upcoming, you make try run. And okay, this is unfortunately the attach command has no try run capability. So I make it serious here, or something is going wrong. Perhaps I have to mention I've done this not for a while. Let's have this one first. Attach this one to this one. And he's still not happy with the try run command. Oh, here we go. Okay, there's no try run on attach. Zpool status should show up 3 disks bootable in a 3-way mirror. Something senseless. -F is for forcing, Patrick. Oh, that's it. So this is how Proxmox is booting today. And perhaps you like our show on ZFS Rocks. Subscribe to the channel, please, and press the bell. And have a look at our great Matrix chat mentioned in the description. You can find other people interesting in ZFS and Proxmox topics. So have a good one, and we will see you soon on ZFS Rocks and on SysOps TV. Thank you for joining, and also Dankeschön, liebe Freunde. Warm thank you for my friends joining me today on this warm, sunny day. Now we'll have gin tonic and a good day. Bye bye on SysOps TV and ZFS Rocks.